In 1940, William Tamaree, a Tlingit elder, sat down with the publisher of the Wrangell Sentinel to tell a story from his boyhood. When Tamaree was 6 years old, the U.S. Army fired cannons on his village, kicked off by a drunken party on Christmas Day, 1869. He revealed a new version of the story that unraveled a massive cover-up and days of violence. Tamaree's story forces us to rethink what we know about the event known as the Bombardment of Wrangell. In today's episode, we'll set the stage by looking at the events leading up to Christmas Day, 1869. We'll shine a light on the key players who become the important figures in the story. In Part 2, we'll explore the fallout in the days, months, and years that followed. Today's episode of Wrangell History Unlocked is the Christmas Bombardment. Chapter 1. Memory. The most well-known first-hand accounts of the bombardment were written by Fort Wrangell's 3 commissioned officers. Without the benefit of the Tlingit perspective, the officers' stories have gone down in history, repeated verbatim over the years. By January 1870, a few newspapers along the West Coast reported on the bombardment. They cribbed details from the officers' reports, but they occasionally included facts from other sources, such as the people who came south aboard steamships carrying the latest news from Alaska. William Tamaree's story in the Wrangell Sentinel in 1940 challenged everything. He also recorded a cassette tape telling the story on another occasion. Together, they comprise the only known eyewitness accounts of the bombardment from the Tlingit side. In 2012, the bombardment story got a major update in the form of a study entitled The Bombardment of Ḳaachx, an.áak'w by Dr. Zachary Jones as part of a grant from the National Park Service to document American battlefields. The study pulls together the Tamaree stories into one place, along with analysis of the Tlingit system of laws and justice. It is a source of authority on the bombardment that can be used as a launchpad to further research. By putting Tamaree, the officers, and the newspaper's versions of events against each other, we can attempt to sift the fact from the fiction. But first, to truly understand the events of Christmas Day, 1869, we need to look at the months and years leading up to it. And we'll start our story 5 years before, in the middle of the Civil War, with the man responsible for the bombardment, First Lieutenant William Barrow. For with William Barrow, things were not always as they seemed. Chapter 2. William Barrow. It was October 1864, and Abraham Lincoln had enough on his plate. The Civil War was halfway into its 4th year. On his desk sat a request for a presidential pardon from Captain William Barrow. According to one biography, William Barrow was 5 feet 11 inches tall, with a florid complexion, brown eyes, and auburn hair. The Army had changed William Barrow's life. Just a few years before, President Lincoln appealed to the American public for volunteers to fight for the Union. William Barrow, a 25-year-old New York City stockbroker, answered the call. He entered service on November 15, 1861, as a second lieutenant. On August 1, 1863, he was promoted to first lieutenant. As part of the 2nd Artillery, he oversaw the Army's biggest guns on the battlefield, machines that took crews to drag into position and operate. William Barrow was involved in some of the war's bloodiest conflicts, including the single deadliest battle of the war, Antietam. His superior officers commended him on his ability to lead artillery units. In 1864, William Barrow was court-martialed and convicted on 2 counts, forgery and making false muster. Barrow wrote to Abraham Lincoln and begged for a, quote, final decision that redress be granted me. Lincoln, who famously loved granting pardons, passed. Lincoln wrote in terse reply, I decline to make any further order in this case. A. Lincoln. Failing to secure Lincoln's pardon, the Army dismissed William Barrow from service on March 8, 1865. Exactly 1 month later, the Civil War was over. The Army still needed men, and President Johnson reinstated William Barrow into the 2nd Artillery as a first lieutenant on July 26, 1865, and sent Barrow and his wife, Mary, to Oregon Territory. Out west, Barrow arrived to find a region inflamed by skirmishes between Native American tribes and new white settlers. This conflict came to be known as the Snake War, a series of guerrilla battles reaching into Oregon, Idaho, California, and Nevada. Barrow devised a plan to fight one tribe by recruiting members of a warring tribe to hunt them down, promising to pay them a share of the spoils. Barrow was clear: take no prisoners. Barrow's lieutenant, Dr. William Mackay, kept a diary of the winter of 1866 to 1867. In meticulous detail, Dr. Mackay accounts for every native man, woman, and child killed under his direction by his scouts. This was a mission of extermination. The first group caught by Mackay's scouts were given away by, quote, signs of one footprint on the light snow of today's print. In July 1867, Barrow was transferred north to Camp Steele in the San Juan Islands of Washington Territory. His arrival made a strong impression on the wife of Major Allen. Mary Julia Tyson Allen wrote a letter to her sister in March 1868 about William Barrow and his wife. I am afraid if I say anything about them, I shall say too much. However, what I do say, remember, is to be repeated to no one. When we started from Baltimore on the steamer, some of the older officers of the regiment came to the major and told him there were some officers on board that he would not want to know or have me know their wives. One of them was Lieutenant Barrow's wife, who has 3 children. Well, of course, I did not become acquainted. Mrs. Barrow is a fine-looking and elegantly dressed person. She leaves her husband and goes to Victoria and makes a stay at the hotel 3 weeks at a time. They seem to have plenty of money and make a great dash wherever they go. He was dismissed from the Army once, but was reappointed, and I heard an officer say the other day they would subscribe to the regiment $1,000 to present him if he would resign. He is a most elegant lieutenant, and if you were in his presence 5 minutes and did not know the man, he would make you believe black was white. But enough of him. But remember, do not hint a word of this, for really I should not like to get his ill will. In September 1868, William Barrow and the rest of Battery I were ordered to report to General Jeff C. Davis, in charge of Alaska, based out of Sitka. General Davis sent the battery to Fort Wrangell in early October 1868 to relieve the command that first arrived, pitched tents, and began construction. The year earlier, after Russia sold its assets in Alaska, the U.S. Army selected 6 sites to establish forts. At the time Fort Wrangell was selected, the location had almost no white people. The Russians had abandoned their fort decades before. The Cassiar Gold Rush in 1861 was played out, bringing few miners. What endured at the site was the Tlingit village, Ḳaachx, an.áak'w, a village in Tlingit country of over 500 people. The village wrapped along the coastline, with clusters of houses arranged by clan, all the way out to a point that stuck out in the sea, serving as a natural breakwater. The United States Army learned from the mistakes of the Russians. In 1834, the Russians built Redoubt St. Dionysius on a small peninsula inside the harbor. The elevation was low, and seawater occasionally found its way in. And within a decade, the fort was surrounded by Tlingit clan houses. When disputes over trade turned into attacks, the fort was vulnerable in all directions. The United States did not build on the same spot. Instead, the Army selected a spot some 500 yards north of the nearest clan house, on a hill sloping down to the coast. The plans called for 12 buildings, protected by a 10-foot wall, taking up just over 1 acre. The skyline of Fort Wrangell was clearly visible from the village, with the chimney stacks of the officers' quarters to the 2-story hospital building atop the hill. Battery I arrived with 49 enlisted men and 5 commissioned officers. Among the commissioned officers, there was Captain and Brevet Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gray. His next in command was First Lieutenant William Barrow, followed by his First Lieutenant Melville Lukes and Second Lieutenant E. Richmond. Dr. A.H. Ḳaachx, in charge of the hospital department, served as the final commissioned officer. Battery I inherited a fort in a state of semi-completion. To complete the work, Captain Gray hired 20 native laborers, paying them as high as $1 a day and 1 meal ration. Battery I also inherited a prisoner. Private Benjamin Harnish arrived in Fort Wrangell in August 1868 and was arrested for desertion just before Battery I arrived. Harnish sat in confinement inside Fort Wrangell, waiting for his trial. 1 year later, he would still be in confinement, waiting. Fort Wrangell soon lost 2 of its 5 commissioned officers, who would not be replaced. In the first 2 months of 1869, the Army transferred Lieutenant Richmond, and Captain Gray became sick and was sent away for medical care, never to return. With Captain Gray's departure, William Barrow was in charge of Fort Wrangell. William Barrow ascended to the command of Fort Wrangell at the same exact time as the U.S. Army was bombarding the nearby Alaskan village of Ḳaachx. William Barrow appointed Melville Lukes as his second in command. The 2 men were close in age. Melville Lukes was 28, while William Barrow was 33. Melville Lukes joined West Point Academy in July 1860. 1 year later, the Civil War broke out. When he graduated in 1864, he was ranked 22nd in his class of 27 graduates and was made a second lieutenant in the 2nd Artillery, eventually becoming a first lieutenant in February 1865. In Alaska, Melville Lukes acquired a number of Tlingit artifacts. 2 pieces acquired by Lukes in Ḳaachx survive to this day. One is a Tlingit rattle, inside of which Lukes carved, "Made by the Alaska Indians, brought by M.R. Lukes, First Lieutenant Officer." The rattle is round with a carved face, a handle, and was likely made for a shaman's use decades before Lukes came to Alaska. The other item is a small, ornately carved tobacco pipe, not longer than 7 inches, in the form of a man fighting off a bear using a paddle. The user inhaled smoke from the bears behind. In his first month in charge, Barrow let the 20 native men employed as laborers at the fort go. He brought them back in April and May for a little less pay, but ended that too. First-hand accounts report that the Tlingit were eager to work, and this loss of income may have been felt harshly. In August 1869, William Henry Seward made his triumphant first voyage to Alaska. Seward survived an assassin's knife the same night Abraham Lincoln was shot. Lincoln died, but Seward lived to negotiate the Treaty of Cession, purchasing Russia's assets in Alaska. When Seward came to Fort Wrangell, William Barrow personally gave Seward an inspection of not just the garrison, but the area outside the walls as well. Seward and some of the officers present went up the Sticking River to the Canadian border. Seward saw Fort Wrangell under the watchful gaze of William Barrow. If trouble lurked under the surface, Seward may not have seen it, but another man would. A month later, a man sent by President Grant would pay a visit not only to Fort Wrangell, but Ḳaachx, an.áak'w, to get the whole story, and the story he found would shock him. Chapter 3. Vincent Collier. When Vincent Collier visited Fort Wrangell, he pulled out his art supplies and drew the place. He drew the skyline of Fort Wrangell against a setting sun, and a peaceful scene of the bustling village with placid waters. He went inside clan houses, too, to draw scenes of life in a Tlingit home. These were scenes he would take back to Washington, D.C. Vincent Collier, 44 years old, was sent to explore Alaska at the request of President Ulysses Grant. Grant formed the Board of Indian Commissioners to advise him on Native American policy. Vincent Collier was selected secretary of the board and was sent to Alaska in 1869 to investigate and report back on Alaska's indigenous population. Collier had a reputation for fearlessness. He was a lifelong devout Quaker. After witnessing the brutality of the First Battle of Bull Run, he founded a Christian missionary group to stand on the edges of battlefields to provide soldiers with medical supplies, religious materials, recreation, and other comforts. In 1863, he recruited and trained a regiment of African American soldiers for the Union Army. After the Civil War, Vincent Collier and his parchment and pen were sent out west to investigate and report back. Collier met Native Americans for the first time and saw the humanity in them. He did not see enemies. He saw future converts to Christianity and American society. Collier was an ardent assimilationist who thought the only path forward for Native Americans was to become more like white people, and he was an early voice in support of the reservation system, which he felt was the only response to the rapid encroachment of native lands by white settlers. Vincent Collier came through Fort Wrangell on his inspection of Alaska in October 1869. As he did with all the forts he visited in Alaska, he called for a dinner with the chiefs of the local tribe, the fort's officers, and all their wives. No record of the dinner exists, other than to suggest it meant Barrow and Chief Ḳaachx were at least acquainted. Collier asked the people who moved to Alaska to write him letters, telling him what they had learned about Alaska's native people and culture. He would include whole copies of these first-hand accounts in his report. Collier went door to door in the village, taking a census. He counted 32 homes for a total of 508 people, 183 women, 159 men, 89 girls, and 77 boys. Every house had at least one child, and 7 houses had 10 or more children. The average house had 16 residents, and there were 9 houses with 20 or more people. While Collier was taking this census, he heard some shouting, then saw a man with a bloody, beaten face walking by him. He approached the man, saw he was Tlingit, and asked what happened. The story shocked him. Leon Smith, assisted by 2 half-drunken discharged soldiers, assaulted an Indian who was passing in front of his store. Mr. Smith, ex-Confederate officer, said that he was under the impression, mistaken as he afterward admitted, that the Indian had struck his little boy, and he only shook the Indian. The drunken soldiers standing by then, of their own accord, unsolicited, Mr. Smith says, by him, seized the Indian, brutally beat him, and stamped upon him. I immediately went to the post and suggested to the commandant that he should have the drunken soldiers arrested and retained for trial. He sent a lieutenant with 2 or 3 men to quell the disturbance, the Indians meanwhile having become excited, and to, quote, use his own discretion about arresting the men. Lieutenant Lukes returned soon after without the drunken soldiers, and gave as his reason that, quote, the Indians struck Mr. Smith's boy, which, as I have said, was disproved. The drunken men belonged to a party of over 100 discharged soldiers who had come down on our steamer from Sitka and were on their way to San Francisco. Some of them had been drummed out of the service for robbing the Greek church at Sitka and for other crimes. I had informed the commandant of their character the morning after our vessel arrived, and suggested to him the propriety of preventing any of them from landing and going to the Indian village. He replied that he had no authority to prevent anyone from landing. I was surprised at this, as I supposed Alaska was an Indian territory and that the military had supreme control. The day after the assault upon the Indian, the commandant came on board the Newburn and asked very kindly my opinion about the propriety of attempting to arrest 2 drunken soldiers. But as there were over 100 soldiers on the boat, and the affair had occurred at near twilight, so that it would be impossible to recognize the men, the impracticability of doing this at that late hour was apparent. Collier came to observe, but he found himself getting involved. He took the beaten man's side and pressed Borrow to act. Borrow and Lukes reacted ambivalently. It happened again when he caught alcohol being unloaded into Fort Wrangell. A quantity of porter and light wines, 10 barrels of ale, and 5 barrels of distilled spirits, whiskey, brandy, etc., were hoisted up from the hold of the Newburn, marked for Leon Smith, post-trader at Wrangell. As I had called the attention of the revenue officers to the violation of President Johnson's order in landing the liquors at Ţaughness, the officer commanding the post at Wrangell, William Borrow, asked me my opinion of the business. I called his attention to the word of the papers permitting the shipment of the liquors from San Francisco. It was the same as at Ţaughness, for the, quote, use of officers at the post. The captain read this, reflected a moment, and then said that he would not permit it to land. The beer and porter was landed and taken into Leon Smith's store, and the whiskey, brandy, rum, etc. was carried up to Sitka. At the time, a barrel was 48 gallons. Collier caught Borrow in the act. The shipments were loaded in San Francisco and got around the prohibition on alcohol by using an exemption for the enjoyment of officers at the post. But this alcohol was to be delivered to Leon Smith, who ran a store and a bowling alley. Collier exposed the flimsy exemption and forced Borrow's hand, sending the liquor on to Sitka. Vincent Collier collected his stories and illustrations and sailed home, the months-long voyage back east. Through the winter he compiled his notes, wrote his reports, and transcribed the letters he received throughout Alaska, especially Fort Wrangell. As he put the finishing touches on his report, he received the first word of the bombardment of Ḳaachx. He looked to his papers, now recognizing he had collected evidence that would foreshadow the dark days that would unfold beginning Christmas night, 1869. Chapter 4, December 25th. William Tamaree and the newspapers agree. There was a big party inside Fort Wrangell on Christmas Day. The Tlingit were invited, and alcohol was served. All of this was completely against Army regulation, a gross misuse of power and privilege. None of the officers, Borrow, Lukes, or Dr. Kirk, say anything about a party. But the evidence suggests it happened. The newspapers had the scoop. The San Francisco Chronicle wrote, "Early on the morning of Christmas Day, the Indians, all prepared for merrymaking, left their settlements and repaired in swarms to the garrison. Here the soldiers had made ample preparations for their entertainment, and the whole day was a continued round of pleasure and festivities. Liquors were freely circulated." California's Daily Alta said, "On the night of Christmas a ball was given by the men of the garrison, to which the Indians were invited as lookers-on." Victoria, British Columbia's Daily Colonist said, "The whole of the population, Indians included, appear to have been observing the time-honored custom of keeping Christmas Day, and some appear to have been making too free use of the intoxicating cup." The most detailed description of the party on Christmas night came from William Tamaree. In the Wrangell Sentinel in 1940, he described how the party happened. "On Christmas Eve, the captain of the fort sends word to all the chiefs of the Indian villages, 'Tonight is Christmas Eve. It is time to be happy. You come up to the fort and be happy and have a good time.' Night comes. It is cold. The wind blows. Raining, snowing. The Indians go up the beach to the fort. Inside the captain's house, everything is warm. Lights, music. The soldiers are playing a violin and accordion." Tamaree is likely right about the musicians. 2 enlisted men in the fort held the job of musician. Tamaree continues, "When you come in the door of the captain's house, there is a big stair going up to a wide hall. At the bottom of the stair are 2 doors opening to rooms off the entry hall. In one of these rooms is the captain's wife. She does not come to the party upstairs. She stays in the room. The Indians go upstairs." There is only one building in Fort Wrangell that matches this description, and it is not the captain's house. That building was 2 stories, but far too small, with a footprint around 500 square feet, and an upstairs loft with a narrow ceiling. Not enough space for a violin, accordion, partygoers, and a dance floor. The one building that matches Tamaree's description is the hospital building. It was 2 stories tall, around 47 feet long, and 33.5 feet wide, for a total footprint around 1,600 square feet. The 8-foot wide porch upstairs added another 376 square feet to the party and offered a beautiful view of Zimovia Strait. The interior design of the hospital building is somewhat of a mystery, but it may have emulated the design of the hospital in Sitka. A surgeon, John Brooke, described Sitka's hospital as a 2-story building with a double door in the front that opens to a hallway with several private rooms and a staircase leading up to a wide open space. There are big consequences of the party being held at the hospital building and not the officers' quarters. First, it suggests the grand scale of the party. This was a big building with a large gathering space and anterooms. Second, this implicates the post surgeon, Henry Kirk. The commander had absolute power everywhere but one place, the hospital department, under the charge of Henry Kirk. Whether he allowed his building to be used for the party willingly or reluctantly, he would be culpable in anything that happened. And things would happen. Back to William Tamaree. Among the Indians are 2 brothers named Isteen and Shawan. They are nephews of Tawat, one of the chiefs of the Indian village. They have their wives. Isteen's wife is named an.áak'w. She is from the south. At Victoria, she has seen white people. She knows white men's dances and has on a dress like white ladies wear. It is wide with hoops, and when the other Indians see her, their eyes pop, for they have never seen such a dress. Áak'w, too, she knows how to do the white man's quadrille, which she learned at the fort in Victoria. The quadrille was a very popular, highly formal style of ballroom dance. 4 couples stood in 4 corners, perfectly upright, and made graceful passes through the middle of the dance floor, linking arms, performing curtsies and bows, spinning partners into the arms of another. Back to Tamaree. Ḳaachx, she is the other brother's wife, Siobhan's wife. She is a pretty Indian girl with rosy cheeks, but she wears only Indian clothes, moccasins, and has a blanket around her. She does not know how to dance like this áak'w. The Indians sit on benches around the wall of the big hall. The soldiers pass plates of sandwiches and much wine. Wine? The Indians do not know what is wine. Pretty soon, everybody's head is going round, Indians and soldiers. Pretty soon, the captain comes and says to áak'w, "We dance?" áak'w then dances with the white captain, and all the Indians sit surprised to see áak'w dancing so nice with the white chief. Then another soldier asks Ḳaachx to dance. Ḳaachx does not know how to dance like áak'w, but she gets up and tries. Soon, everyone around is laughing at Ḳaachx trying to dance like áak'w. All the white chiefs are laughing. This is the moment that sparks the conflict that will last for days. It begins with Ḳaachx on the dance floor being humiliated. Says Tamaree. Ḳaachx's husband sees his wife and everybody laughing at her, and he gets very mad. He is much ashamed that everybody should laugh at his wife. He steps on the dance floor and pulls her away from the white soldier and throws her down the stairs. Ḳaachx rolls over and over to the bottom of the stairs. She screams. Then, down below, the captain's wife, who is in the room at the bottom of the stairs, hears Ḳaachx scream. She rushes out into the hall and picks up Ḳaachx and takes her into the room. The captain's wife in Tamaree's story is Angelina Mueller, the London-born wife of Sergeant and Quartermaster Jacob Mueller. She had two small boys, Jacob and George Oscar, the latter born in Fort Wrangell in January. She worked with her hands, washing Fort Wrangell's dirty laundry as the post laundress. Ḳaachx and Angelina Mueller were from opposite sides of the world. They led different lives, spoke different languages, and came from different cultures. But in Fort Wrangell, they lived with the same threat: men. Angelina Mueller went out of her way to protect Ḳaachx, and it would cost her, said Tamaree. But before she can close the door, Siobhan, who is a big, strong fellow, comes down the stairs. He wants his wife. He wants to send her home so she cannot be laughed at anymore. He pulls at the door. It comes open a little way, and the captain's wife puts her hand against Siobhan's face to shove him back, and Siobhan bites off her finger. The Daily Colonist agrees with Tamaree. Angelina Mueller was trying to protect áak'w from her husband, and a physical fight ensued, in which Siobhan bit off one of Angelina Mueller's fingers. Commander William Barrow's written report begins with him learning of the finger bite. He estimates it was 11:10 p.m. Said Barrow, "Siobhan, he having while in her house, just outside of the stockade, and in the act of shaking hands with her, bitten off the third finger of her right hand between the first and second joints, her husband, quartermaster sergeant of this battery, and a citizen named Campbell, being present at the time." Barrow mentions nothing about a party or how Siobhan and Angelina Mueller came to be in the same place at such a late hour. He also places the assault outside of his garrison walls. Newspapers would pick up Barrow's claim that the finger bite happened in the act of shaking hands, like a chivalrous hand kiss. Given the tremendous amount of pressure required to remove a human finger using teeth alone, Tamaree's version, which describes Angelina Mueller pushing her weight, momentum, and force into Siobhan's face, is a more plausible scenario than a cordial hand kiss turned into a surprise attack. The sequence Tamaree describes next is highly consequential, and it directly challenges the official reports of Barrow and Lukes. Tamaree says, "Now, the captain's wife screams. All the soldiers from above rush down the stairs. There is the captain's wife, holding her hand, and the blood is pouring down her arm. The captain steps forward. He is very mad. He tells the soldiers to shoot Siobhan down. Isteen tries to save his brother, and the soldiers shoot both the brothers down. Siobhan falls, shot through the heart, and the other brother shot through the arm. Tamaree says Siobhan and Isteen were shot by soldiers inside the fort at the party under orders from the captain. Since he uses the captain to mean any number of officers, Borrow, Łukasz, even Jacob Mueller, it's unclear who gave the order. In contrast to Tamaree's version, the officer reports and the newspapers say nothing about a shooting inside Fort Wrangell. Instead, they say everyone, including Siobhan, fled after the finger bite, returning on foot to the village. At this juncture, Tamaree and the officers' stories get even farther apart, but they share one critical fact. A detachment of soldiers, led by Łukasz, visited the village late Christmas night. This is where Melville Łukasz, Borrow's second-in-command, begins his written report. He says word of the finger bite spread through the garrison at midnight. Said Łukasz, "I proceeded to her quarters to verify the report, and there saw that the third finger of her right hand had been bitten or torn off by an Indian named Siobhan, as all present stated. I returned for my saber and belt, reported to the commanding officer." Borrow reported what he told Łukasz. "I immediately sent Lieutenant Łukasz with a detachment of 20 men to take him, with instructions to bring him in, if possible, without bloodshed, and only to use their arms in case of resistance or in self-defense." Łukasz reported carrying out the order. "I then set off for the Indian village with a detachment of 20 men to arrest the Indian Siobhan. Having arrived in that portion of the village nearest the garrison, I intended to enter Ťaoť's house, expecting to find there the Indian I wanted. Before entering Ťaoť's house, I met an Indian in red cap and shirt named Áak'w, who, upon being asked to do so, told me that Siobhan had left Ťaoť's house and gone to another nearby, which he pointed out to me." Áak'w would play a critical role in the story later that night. Here, Łukasz credits Áak'w with steering him away from Ťaoť's house, toward the house where Siobhan might be found. Łukasz continues, "I entered the house with 12 men, leaving the remainder to guard the entrance outside. Siobhan was sitting down near the fire opposite the entrance, with nothing on but pants. The position of the detachment in the house formed a single rank along the nearest side of the quadrangular space, with instructions to fire whenever I should give the signal. With Siobhan there were Isteen, his brother, Siobhan's wife, an old woman who was sitting up, and perhaps a few others sleeping in different parts of the house." Łukacz's description is similar to that of a firing squad, 12 armed men spaced out in a line, aiming for the same man. The soldiers had their backs against the wall of the clan house, along the side with the centered entrance. There may have been 6 or more soldiers on each side of the door. Łukasz says he walked out in front of his men to engage with Siobhan. Said Łukasz, "I tapped Siobhan on the shoulder, saying that I wanted him to come with me. He arose from his sitting posture and said he would put on his vest. After that, he wished to get his coat. Feeling convinced that this was merely to gain time, that he wished to trifle with me, I began to be more urgent. Siobhan appeared less and less inclined to come away with me, and in this, the latter part of the parley, he became impudent and menacing and raising his hands as if to strike me. I admonished him against such actions, and tried my utmost to avoid extreme measures in arresting him. About this time, Isteen, probably apprehending danger to his brother Siobhan, rushed forward in front of the detachment, extending his arms theatrically, and exclaiming, as I suppose under the circumstances, 'Shoot! Kill me! I am not afraid!' Siobhan, seeing this, also rushed upon the detachment, endeavoring to snatch the musket away from one of the men on the right of the detachment. For the soldiers to be spaced evenly along the wall, they would have been 2 to 3 feet apart, wielding muskets almost 5 feet long. Packed closely together, with their backs against the wall, these 12 soldiers would have crowded each other, making maneuvers difficult. Somehow, in the chaos, these soldiers kept an eye on Łukasz, as well as Siobhan and Istine. What happened next would have far-ranging consequences, said Łukasz. Still wishing to avoid the loss of life if possible, I tried to give him 2 or 3 saber cuts over the head to stun without killing him. In doing this, I had given the preconcerted signal, by raising my hand, to fire. I should judge about 6 or 8 shots were fired during the melee, and only ceasing by the Indian Siobhan falling at the feet of the detachment dead. In the post-return filed for December 1869, William Barrow tersely noted, "An Indian killed and 1 wounded in attempting to resist U.S. authority for this unrest." Łukasz continues, "Istine and the others running to their holes, everything became quiet. I then directed the detachment not to renew the firing until further orders. I had Istine pulled out and discovered he was bleeding profusely from a wound in his right arm near the shoulder. 2 handkerchiefs were tied round his arm above the wound to check the bleeding. My first thought was to arrest him also for interference, but afterward, considering that he was intoxicated, and that his interference was to protect his brother Siobhan, who, in my opinion, was in the same condition of intoxication, I concluded that he had been sufficiently punished and directed that he be carried over to the hospital for treatment, and that the dead Indian should be carried over to the guardhouse. While preparing to carry over the 2 Indians, a tumult of challenging by the guard outside the house and Indians shouting to their friends began." Here, Łukasz describes unrest from the neighboring homes of the village. He describes an encounter with Áak'w. "Leaving First Sergeant Dean to superintend preparations for the transportation of the Indians, I went outside and found 3 near the door, the sub-chief, Áak'w, who, I suppose, did the shouting, and was the cause of the challenging. At that time I could not see whether Áak'w was armed or not, although the men said he had a knife, and to beware of him. I told him that I had finished my business, and that I was about to return with the men. I told him that if he wished to say anything to the soldier Tayi, he could do so in the morning. With that I gently led him toward the house, and advised him to go to bed. That was the last I saw of Áak'w that night. The 2 Indians were accordingly brought over, and the result reported to the commanding officer." While Tamaree offers a completely different story about how Siobhan and Istine were shot, he does include a story about a posse of soldiers visiting Áak'w's house late Christmas night. According to Tamaree, later that night soldiers come to Áak'w's house. Áak'w then has a house near where the sawmill is now. The soldiers say to Áak'w, "Áak'w, you want to fight? We have killed your nephews. Are the Indians going to fight?" But Áak'w sits very still. He says nothing. The soldiers go home. Tramp, tramp. They march down the beach back to the fort. In both Łukasz and Tamaree's versions, Áak'w is standing in front of his house when he faces down soldiers of the United States Army. There is no record of what Áak'w said, if anything, but the soldiers do quite a bit of the talking. At the end of the encounter, both Tamaree and Łukasz say the soldiers returned to the fort. Łukasz says he and his soldiers returned to Fort Wrangell with the body of Siobhan and the badly injured Istine. The Daily Alta adds, "They were both brought into the garrison, Siobhan's dead body being placed in the guardhouse and Istine taken to the hospital for surgical treatment. It is unclear why Siobhan, a dead man, would need to be removed from his own home to be placed in the guardhouse. In the end, in both Tamaree and the officers' stories, the dead body of Siobhan and the mortally wounded Istine are inside the walls of Fort Wrangell late on Christmas night." Barrow and Łukasz tell divergent stories at this point. Safely back inside the walls of Fort Wrangell, Melville Łukasz says, "I dismissed the detachment, and supposing no further disturbance would occur, was sitting in the post surgeon's quarters. But Borrow writes, "Apprehending trouble, I had turned out the entire force under my command, and as soon as the firing was heard at the ranch, I immediately sent a detachment of 10 men as far as the store of the post trader, some 300 yards from the garrison, with instructions to act in concert with Lieutenant Luke's party, should they require assistance. A picket guard was stationed around the camp, and everything placed in a condition of defense." Borrow went high alert, while Luke's was standing down. Luke's immediately went to the private quarters of Post Surgeon Henry Kirk, where they could speak candidly about the problem on their hands. What they couldn't know was that their problem was about to get much, much worse. For in the village, *áak'w was being roused with terrible news that would set off an equal reaction under Tlingit law. According to Tamaree, "Not far from *áak'w lives the brother's father, *áak'w. He is asleep while his sons have been killed. But his wife, when she hears of it, wakes him. She shakes his shoulder and says, '*áak'w, the white soldiers have killed your sons. Wake up, your sons are dead. What are you going to do?' *áak'w gets up. He dresses. He puts on his red war jacket. I remember it well. I have seen it many times. It is all red and has pockets around the bottom for shells for his Hudson Bay gun. *áak'w gets his Hudson Bay gun and starts for the fort. He walks along the beach, and it is still cold and windy, half raining, half snowing. He walks. *áak'w set out to avenge Shawan's death by killing a white man. Any white man would do. And that is where Leon Smith would play his role in the story. Chapter 5. Leon Smith. On Christmas Day, 1862, the Union Army moved 250 infantrymen into a garrison on Galveston Island, Texas. This was the Union's first foothold in Texas since the Civil War began, and it was in these precarious, low-level sandy barrier islands just off the coast of Texas in the Gulf of Mexico. Union warships roamed the harbor. Confederate General John Magruber hatched an attack on the Union garrison by land and sea. From land, the Confederates positioned heavy artillery hidden inside buildings. A cadre of volunteers waited to rush the island, using ladders to get across like a drawbridge. From sea, a small fleet of Confederate vessels planned to enter the harbor under the darkness of fog of night, to fend off the Union Navy. Leon Smith, a well-known steamship captain, was made Commodore of the Confederate fleet. The attack began New Year's Eve, 1862. The plan did not go off as expected. The Confederate ships were spotted early and fled when a Union watchman set off a flare. The artillery on land didn't know this and commenced blasting the Union garrison as planned, causing damage but little loss of life. The Confederate volunteers, who intended to storm Galveston Island with ladders, gave up when their ladders proved too short. Amid the fallout, with no ships to challenge them, the Union Navy arrived and began blasting the city. All of a sudden came the Confederate ships Neptune and Bayou City. Leon Smith sailed aboard the Bayou City. The ship made a pass at ramming the USS Harriet Lane, a sleek, powerful vessel laden with heavy artillery. The Bayou City delivered only a glancing blow with minimal damage to either ship. Next, the Neptune attempted to ram the Harriet Lane, delivering only minimal damage, but sustaining a cannon shot to the Neptune that caused it to begin to sink. The Bayou City made a second pass at ramming the Harriet Lane, and this time it succeeded in jamming its bow into the Harriet Lane's wheelhouse, effectively disabling the ship. The Confederates dropped a plank and stormed the deck of the Harriet Lane, seizing the prize Union ship and cargo for the Confederacy. The battle ceased. Under a white flag, Leon Smith paddled a boat to parley with the Union officers. He asked them to surrender all their ships. Instead, the Union accepted the loss of the Harriet Lane and fled. It was the last time the Union occupied Texas in the Civil War. Magruder recommended to his superiors that Leon Smith be made captain of the Harriet Lane. The story of the capture of the Harriet Lane became a huge story in the North and South. Leon Smith's name gained a reputation. After the Civil War, reports say Leon Smith and Magruder fled to Mexico to avoid arrest. They split up, and Leon Smith hid out in Galveston, Texas, laying low to avoid arrest. So long as his fame followed him, he would never be safe in the South or the North. He set his eyes on a fresh start in the North, the far North, Alaska. His first attempt at getting into business in Alaska ended in disaster. In November 1868, a cargo schooner carrying thousands of dollars worth of his merchandise wrecked off Vancouver Island. Wrote Smith, "I consider my loss no less than $20,000. Although my goods are insured, I have lost my winter's prospects. My baggage is all lost. I shall sail for Fort Wrangell and see how things look. Yours truly, Leon Smith." Leon Smith, his wife, Mary, and their son, Leon B., made it to Fort Wrangell on March 1, 1869. Leon Smith found his match with a business partner named William King Lear. William King Lear was a 36-year-old ex-Army officer and former merchant of the Fraser River Gold Rush. When that dried up, he moved into Alaska, arriving at Fort Wrangell in September 1868, finding work as a post-settler. Smith and Lear owned 2 log buildings along the beach, about 300 yards south of Fort Wrangell. This was the beginning of the future downtown Wrangell, on either side of Lynch Street today. The taller building served as a general store, while the longer building was home to a bowling alley. While Smith and Lear were certainly post-settlers in that they sold to the men and families of Fort Wrangell, they also traded with Alaska natives, who far outnumbered the white population, at least 5-1. In a letter, Leon Smith offered his opinion of the Tlingit he came to know at Fort Wrangell. Smith was positively effusive. "I have found them to be quiet and seem well disposed toward the whites. They take up salmon, fish oil, blankets, domestics, red cloth, beads, molasses, flour, and in fact every other article suitable for Indian trade. The Stick tribe is a very honest tribe and partial to the whites." In Tamaree's tape recording, he describes why Leon Smith liked the Tlingit so much. "He sells food. He bought skins, furs. A noble, heavy-set man of the earth is what they called him. He loved the Tlingit people for the sales he made to them. The white man marketed to the Tlingit people. This is the way this man is. He loves Tlingit people. Regardless of how things were, he loved them for money." Late on Christmas night, well after the party had ended, and after Melville Lukes's detachment returned from their trip to the village, Leon Smith stood in front of his store. It was a half-moon night, and the moon was still low on the horizon. In the tape recording, Tamaree describes what Ḳaachx saw. "Behold, he looked at him nearby. He was pacing back and forth on his front porch aimlessly. With his whistling, he knew how to whistle. What was he doing?" In the 1940 Sentinel version, Tamaree describes the moment like this. "Ḳaachx walks, Pretty soon he comes to Smith's trading post. He sees Smith walking across his porch. Well, here is a white man. Indians' law says when one of their men is killed by another tribe, the other tribe must pay with the life of one of their men. White men have killed Skutdu's sons. Here is a white man. Tamaree describes how Skutdu raised his Hudson Bay gun, which was loaded with shot, the kind used for hunting ducks. He pointed at Smith and shot him. He fell on the house front porch. He shot him right in the stomach. It made a sound of crackling. In the Sentinel, Tamaree said, "As soon as he has killed Smith, Skutdu becomes afraid. Quick, he runs through the storm into the woods behind Wrangell to hide." In his tape recording, Tamaree elaborated, "It was not until after the killing of the white man that he became conscious of what he did. Fear came upon him. This is the way it always is. It is when a man is killed that fear comes upon the one who killed a person. He ran off into the forest." Years later, Smith's son, Leon B., would write his father was shot in an Indian ambush. According to William Barrow, he learned of the shots this way. About 1:00 a.m. of the morning of December 26, 1869, the sergeant of the guard reported several shots in the direction of the store, and in a few minutes word was brought to me that Mr. Leon Smith, partner of the post trader W.K. Lear, had been shot near the door of the store. There are typos in the official reports, and one of them is to turn 1 a.m. into 10 a.m. in Barrow's account. Based on the context, it's clear Barrow is not talking about 10 a.m. The shot that hit Smith was audible from Fort Wrangell, a distance Barrow estimates was only 300 yards. At the time of the shot, Łukasz states he was sitting in post surgeon's quarters when, about an hour or thereabouts after my return, a shot was heard from the direction of the store of the post trader. Taking with me Private McGee, I ran down there, and while on the way Private McGee drew my attention to an object lying on the ground near the plank walk running between the store and the garrison. Upon examination, it proved to be Mr. Leon Smith. Mr. Smith was lying on his breast upon a low stump alongside of the plank walk, with arms extended and a revolving pistol fallen from the grasp of the right hand. I first supposed him dead, but by placing him in a more comfortable position and speaking to him, he groaned merely. I then sent to the garrison for a stretcher and men. At about this time Gleason and Henderson came up. In order to preserve the body from attempted mutilation, the three present posted themselves nearby to look out for Indians in ambush. After a few moments I went up in front of the store and told those inside to bring out a blanket with which to carry Mr. Smith to the hospital. Łukasz does not indicate who is inside of Smith's store. Could it be Smith's wife and young son? Could it be William King Lear? Whoever it was, they were likely hiding, having just heard the shot that struck Leon Smith. Łukasz continues. This done, I posted 3 men who had previously sent to defend the store behind obstacles in front of it. After having remained with the pickets a short time in order to understand the condition of things around the store and to observe any movements in the village, I returned to the garrison to inquire into the circumstances of the shooting of Mr. Smith and to receive orders in the case. The celebration of Christmas Day in Fort Wrangell had turned into bloodshed. Angelina Mueller nursed a stump where her finger had been, while Leon Smith and Istine fought for their lives, bleeding out from gunshot wounds, and the dead body of Shawan lay inside the walls of Fort Wrangell. This was just the beginning, for the next day would bring even greater destruction. Through the darkness of night, both sides prepared for the day to come. Wrangell History Unlocked is produced by Ronan Rooney. Music by Mary Rooney.